Good afternoon, everyone. Friday, the 26th of January, and another history chat, an update on the events that happened in British history this week. Last week of January. So, first off, hello to Leslie from South Carolina. Very good of you to join us, and thank you for all your support as well, Leslie. Martin, nice to see you as well. QL Library, hello all, and hello to you too. Lovely, one of my regulars here on Fridays. Jen Ingle, another regular, so lovely to see you, Jen. Where are you coming in from today? The sun is shining in Cumbria, lovely. Peter Smith, first time here. Well, welcome, Peter. Hope you enjoy it, and I'll explain a little bit about what we do in a moment. Sarah Jane, hello to you. Uncle Heavy. Hello, folks. Maybe I know some of you already have, like Leslie and Jen, but if you just put in the chat where you're coming in from, because one of the wonderful things in the History Chat community is it is worldwide. Obviously, I specialise in British history, and I'm in Britain. I live in Worcester. But if you're looking at a map of England, for those of you who don't really know Britain or England very well, just to the southwest of Birmingham in the Midlands, in the old Kingdom of Mercia, and. We've got Norwich, Peter Smith from Norwich. Thank you very much. Shanghai, or David, very good evening to you. Goodness knows how many hours you are. I'm guessing you're about 8 hours ahead of us. So thank you very much for tuning in. North Carolina, Bletchley, Sarah Jane, Milton Keynes. Of course, we know Bletchley Park from the Second World War and the cracking of the German spy codes, in particular Enigma. It's 9 p.m. in Shanghai. Well, I very much appreciate your support then, David. Anyway, welcome everyone. Just explain a little bit about how this works. Many of you will have come across my other videos, which are really well scripted. Well, at least I think they're really well scripted and packed with information and quite tight. These live chats aren't scripted at all. Okay, well, I mean, I've got a few idiot notes, just so that's it. Just so that I don't go completely off on a tangent. But this is much more jazz history. Okay, this is probably as we would be if we were chatting in the pub or over a coffee or something. Okay, so for those of you who want lots of pretty images and a real tight script and just one story, this isn't for you. Okay, this is much more of a general chit chat. And we're really going to cover the events that happened in British history this week, just real snippets. And if nothing else, you'll be a little bit wiser, and you could probably talk to your friends and impress them as well by coming up with bits of information they had not got a clue about. So, and as I say, we're going to, the other great thing is you have an opportunity to chat, ask questions, share thoughts, share pet subjects, pet theories. And I will keep stopping and looking at the chats because you're taking the time to put comments in. I will read them out. I'll attempt to either answer them or indeed ask the question out to the wider group and see what happens. Okay, so a little bit different to the normal videos. I think you got that one right. And today, normally we go for an hour. Sometimes it's gone on a lot longer than an hour, hasn't it, my regulars? I'm going to try and keep it short because this week so far, I haven't released a proper video on YouTube, and that's because I'm doing something a bit different. I am moving from the British invading lots of other countries. I do a lot of talks around the British Empire and things like that. I'm actually doing one that going far back into history when it was the Brits on the receiving end. So I'm actually putting together, and I've got the script. I'm just going to record it. Hopefully by the end of today, it's going to be up on YouTube. Julius Caesar's invasions of Britain back in 55 and 54 BC. So as I say, very different to my last video on David Niven in the Second World War, but a fascinating piece of British history. I want to delve back into some more British history rather than just being a prisoner of 19th century and First World War, Second World War. And I hope that meets with a lot of people's approval. It might not. Some people will. I know some of you are massive fans of what I do in the 19th century and love the fact that I go and touch subjects that a lot of other folk don't like to do, Britain's colonial wars. And I know a lot of you love some of my talks about characters from the First and Second World Wars as well. But hopefully you'll enjoy me going back into a bit of history and sort of telling the story of where Britain's come from and some of the landscapes and stuff around in Britain to this day, whether you live here or whether you're visiting here. So there you go. So hopefully we're not going. I won't ramble for too long today. He says, having rambled for 5 minutes already. It's not going well, is it? But so let's just quickly see. Cure Library. You think that might be interesting? Well, wow, the Romans. That's great. Jen, it wasn't great for the Britons, but for the Romans it was. But anyway, I'm going to tell the story, and yeah, and has a tie-in with where I was brought up in Hertfordshire, actually, where Julius Caesar is reputed to have fought his final battle at Devil's Dyke against Cassivelaunus, the British leader, at a place called Devil's Dyke in Wheathampstead. And that's where I grew up. So just nice to have that as a link, isn't it? But then, quite frankly, you know, those of us who live in Britain know you've only got to turn a corner and there's a bit of history there. So without further ado, let's start with this week in British history. Thank you, Uncle Heavy. What did the Romans ever do for us? It had to come into, we had to have a Monty Python line in there somewhere. 21st of January, 1670, Claude Duval, gentleman highwayman, was executed. He was hanged at Tyburn in London. This was in Reformation. No, not even Reformation. Restoration, England. This is the time of Charles II coming back. And Duval supposedly had, he'd been a stable hand, a groom to some royalist exiles in France. And when Charles II was reinstated as king, he came back with them. And he decided that he didn't really want to be a stable hand or a groom, and he basically became a highwayman. And he was known as a bit of a genteel, you know, this is the French at their very best, isn't it? You know, rather than being a, you know, a nasty British thug, a bit like Dick Turpin, Duval, by all accounts, was a gentleman. He never shot anybody. He never used violence. Obviously, he threatened violence with his pistol, but he never was actually violent, which, again, very different to Dick Turpin, who, quite frankly, psychopath is probably a fair expression for the man. But Duval actually held up a coach once and refused to take any money off the gentleman in the coach if he could have a dance with his wife. And they danced a sort of a courtly dance in this lane, very active around the north side of London, Highgate, Holloway, all that sort of area of North London. Of course, it was out in the countryside in those days. He fled to France, got things a little bit hot for him, but then he came back to Britain and he was arrested in London. He was arrested at a pub called the Hole in the Wall pub in Covent Garden. And the pub is still there, actually, to this day. It's not called the Hole in the Wall anymore. It's called the Marquis of Granby. And there's a good story around that particular pub name, but that's for another day, okay? But he was arrested. He was hanged at Tyburn, one of many highwaymen to be hanged at Tyburn. He really set this precedent as the gentleman highwayman, which still to this day, highwaymen are very much put in that sort of heroic, almost chivalric sort of robber. And of course, you know, reality was, you know, they were, you know, they were armed bandits, really. So and he was, as I say, after his execution, he was buried, or reputedly buried, in St. Paul's Church in Covent Garden. So there you go. Claude Duval, gentleman highwayman, in many respects almost the prototype highwayman in Britain. The last highwayman to be hanged was a chap called Robert Snooks, who was caught for highway robbery in Hertfordshire. And strangely enough, actually, my school did a play about Robert Snooks. I was in it. I was the usher in the courtroom. I thought I had a really important part, but I think it was a real bit part, really, wasn't it? But tell a story about Robert Snooks. I'm going to tell a story about Britain's highwaymen at some stage. Dick Turpin, probably Robert Snooks, Claude Duval in more detail, and several others. We'll talk about, and of course, as I say, not least Dick Turpin. But I'd like to do a little series on that because I think it'd be quite fun. And it's not military, but it's I think it's great stories there. and of that period. Let me just have a little look here. We're talking about Rorke's Drift. I see Rorke's Drift's going to make an appearance this week. Bear with me, folks. Bear with me. 21st. Oh, one thing I should say: Restoration England in general know this, I think. But I've recently been doing a series of talks on Stuart dynasty, Stuart Britain, for an organisation called Restless. It's an online thing. It's been really good fun. And this week, actually, I was talking about it was a two-parter. It was the Commonwealth and the Restoration, and it's fascinating. And the Stuarts get a very bad press, and in many respects, actually, let me ask that question. Okay, this is Vox Pops. Get yourselves ready for the chat here. The Stuarts, are they the worst royal dynasty Britain's ever had, or England's ever had? Be interested to know. What do you think? Plantagenets could be a bit iffy. We've got the Georgians, we've got the Tudors, we've got the Windsors, got the Plantagenets, got the House of Normandy. Who are the worst? But the Stuarts, as I say, get a very bad press. But what was interesting in Charles II's time is that just how many institutions that are still around in Britain now and landmarks came in that short period of time. And, we're talking about the Royal Society, Theatre Royal in Drury Lane, Lloyd's of London, all started in his the Royal Observatory at Greenwich, Chelsea pensioners, as well as New Amsterdam becoming New York, Bombay being taken over by the British as part of Charles II's dowry. So yeah, fascinating times. And obviously we had the Great Fire of London and the rebuilding of London, principally by Christopher Wren, which includes, of course, the iconic St. Paul's Cathedral. So, there's a lot happens from that period, which is interesting. Leslie, they were. Yeah, I tend to be with you on that one. Tudors seem the most bloodthirsty. That's a good call, actually, Jen. I think that the Tudors probably were. And actually, I'll be honest, from the blood, Henry VIII in particular, although the rest of them were up to it, weren't they? But David, you're off onto Isandlwana, Zulu Wars. Yes. Uncle Heavy's already said, don't forget the debacle, great victory of Isandlwana. We're coming to that. Trust me, you know that I like my Zulu Wars. We'll be coming there this week. And hello, Carl from Stockholm. Lovely to see you with us as well today. The Normans were the worst, but the Stuarts were the last to try absolute monarchy and divine right. Yes, they were. And they were sort of out of kilter with English political thinking at the time. And in particular English more so than Scottish, but they fell out with the Scots big time as well. So anyway, back to the storylines. Shall we go for this? 22nd of January, 1828. The Duke of Wellington becomes Prime Minister. The Duke of Wellington, victor of Waterloo, victor in the Peninsular Wars in Spain and Portugal, of course, victor in India prior to that in the Mysore Wars and the Maratha Wars. But he... by 1828, he actually resigned as it become a sort of leading influential figure in the Conservative Party in the 1820s. And in 1828, he resigned as Commander-in-Chief of the British Army to become Prime Minister. He lasted for about 2 years in this role, during which time, probably two significant things to talk about. One was that he oversaw the Catholic emancipation, which was quite a big thing he was very conservative. He was against extending the franchise and things like that to working people because they needed to know their place. I mean, he was definitely conservative with a capital C as well as a small c, but he actually presided over Catholic emancipation. So Catholics could now have the right to vote and also to sit in Parliament. And this is the first time it had happened that they had that right since, well, actually, Elizabethan times. Well, there's a brief period in Stuart history, but first time at that stage, 150, 200 years that Catholics had any sort of legal rights in Britain to be represented and to take a leading right. They also had the opportunity to now finally become officers in the military. And what's really interesting is you suddenly got the floodgates opened, and we suddenly saw a whole series of Catholic officers, not least from Ireland, becoming British officers and actually rising to very senior ranks. One who comes immediately to mind was General Butler, one of the Ashanti Ring, Wolseley's Ashanti Ring. And Butler was actually quite a, I would say, an Irish nationalist, despite serving in the British Army. He definitely believed in home rule for Ireland. So yeah, that's a big change. The other interesting thing in the Duke of Wellington, as Prime Minister, he fought a duel. Because of that Catholic emancipation, the Earl of Winchelsea basically accused him of introducing popery into England, and Duke of Wellington took offence, and they met at dawn, pistols drawn, in a duel. Duke of Wellington shot first. He missed. He later claimed that he had deliberately missed, but he was known as despite being the victor at Waterloo, he was known as a reasonably poor shot. And so many commentators even at the time thought he probably was actually trying to go for the Earl of Winchelsea and genuinely missed. Winchelsea then had his turn, and he just raised his pistol in the air and fired it upwards. And their honour was served, and the duel. And yeah, you can't really see Rishi Sunak fighting a duel with, I don't know, Keir Starmer on, I don't know, Battersea Common or Wandsworth Common or something, could you? But that would be a talking point, I guess. But there you go. Which, let me just see what folk are saying. Stephen Adams, this is exciting. God, Stephen, you must lead a good life. I'm catching the broadcast live before heading out to work, covering the War of 1812. Next week, I'll show my students your talk, Burning the White House. Stephen, thank you. I think you're in Chicago, but I stand to be corrected on that. And yeah, bear with me. I'm actually looking to do some more resources around to help teachers, principally in the UK, but probably will help teachers like yourself in the USA as well. But just bear with me on that. I've got more ideas than you can shake a stick at. But lovely that you could join us, Stephen. Thank you very much. The East India Company is older than the Stuart dynasty. Yes, it is. It was founded, you're absolutely right, 1600, Queen Elizabeth I. And it grew from a simple trading company into a company that at one stage ruled more territory than the rest of than the British government ruled. Question, Jim. Have relations between the English and Irish always been rocky and divided? Wow, what a great question. What do folk think, actually? If we were in a Zoom call or something like that, or we were all sitting around a table in a pub, we would all be chiming in, wouldn't we? Unfortunately, the way that these lives in YouTube are performed, I sort of have to do quite a lot of the talking. But I'd be really interested, what do other people think? Have they always been rocky? My overall take is they've been rocky for a large part of history. What the English called the Irish problem, and I guess most Irish people call the English problem, they've obviously been significant flashpoints, and there've been times where things have been different. But I would say it's always been certainly patchy, rocky, and fundamentally the Irish didn't want to be anglicised. There were times where they probably could have accepted an English king of a fashion, but actually it was the whole idea of being anglicised that probably rocked against. And then, of course, we introduced a religious dimension into it after the Reformation. And saw a really good programme actually this week on, I can't remember which channel it was on, PBS, is it PBS America? PSB America, something like that. And it was all about the Irish Civil War, 1922 to 24. Fascinating, really fascinating. I'm fascinated by Irish history, actually. As an Englishman, got to be really careful about, I'd love to do some talks about it. Obviously, I have to tread carefully. But I think actually English folk need to understand the history of Britain's only land neighbour. And obviously, and the history extends into Northern Ireland, of course, and it crosses over the Irish Sea so often. And most Brits don't really understand it at all, over and above the IRA. What do people say? Jen Ingalls says, yes, sadly, she thinks British-Irish relations, English-Irish relations have always been pretty poor. Uncle Heavy, thank you very much. January the 26th, 1976, Concorde began regular flight schedules. Thank you for sharing that one. I didn't know that one. Thank you very much. Thank you. Glad to catch me at dawn in Houston. Thank you very much. Right. need to bring back the politicians dueling, Sarah James says. It could be more like gladiators or something like that, couldn't it? They could have big inflatable bashers that they hit each other with or something. But anyway, that's this is so not like my videos, isn't it? Where are we at? Oh, well, yes, loads of you have been waiting for this one. 22nd of January 1879, the Zulus inflict a crushing defeat on the British at the Battle of Isandlwana. The Battle of Isandlwana in the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879. The British had basically, or the British on the ground in South Africa, had concocted a war with the Zulus. Eventually, it presented an ultimatum, which, quite frankly, the Zulu king was never going to be able to deliver on. And that was part of the ultimatum. And it's not the only time it's ever happened. The Austrians gave the Serbians in 1914 a very similar ultimatum. The Austrians weren't keen on the Serbians apologizing for the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. They wanted to take out Serbia, and they presented an ultimatum, which was basically, there's no way the Serbs were going to accept it, and therefore the Austrians now have a cause to invade. And basically, this is exactly what the British did in 1879. British on the ground, the British High Commissioner in South Africa, Sir Bartle Frere, and his military commander, Lord Chelmsford. Interestingly, Benjamin Disraeli, British Prime Minister at the time, had specifically told them not to have a war with the Zulus. He had his hands full with a campaign in Afghanistan at the time, desperately trying to the Second Afghan War. And so Chelmsford and Sir Bartle Frere basically did a war on the sly, and they could sort of, because in those days there was no telegraph between Britain and South Africa. The telegraph went as far as the island of Madeira in the Atlantic, which is just off the west coast of Africa, sort of around the Canaries, close to. And then any messages had to come by mail ship, steamship, all the way from Madeira, all the way down to Cape Town in South Africa. So the grand plan was invade Zululand fast with the resources that we have here in South Africa, some regular British troops, lots of local recruits as well, both from the white population and the black population, African population in the Natal colony in South Africa. Have a quick victory, defeat the Zulus, because let's be honest, they only have spears, and how's that going to stand up against a modern British army? And we defeat them, and we would then inform London what we'd done and say, I'm really sorry we've done that, but Benjamin Disraeli, if you want to tell the Queen that you've no longer she can't have Zululand as part of her empire, be my guest. It all went horribly wrong. Lord Chelmsford invaded. British actually invaded in 3 different columns. Chelmsford accompanied the strongest column that was heading towards the Zulu capital. And the Zulus sent out their army to oppose it. And you will know, if you go into my channel, that I've done several talks on the Battle of Isandlwana, in fact, several on the Zulu War generally. Long story short, the Zulus managed to outwit Chelmsford. Chelmsford believed that he had the Zulu army was to his east, and he set out. He was actually very scared that the Zulus wouldn't engage in a battle. He thought they might fight a guerrilla war, which, when you're trying to do a quick war on the sly to defeat the Zulus and then report back to London, that's the last thing he wanted. What he wanted was a decisive battle to defeat the Zulus once and for all. So he took half his force out on the morning of the 22nd of January 1879, left Isandlwana camp, and left a sizable force in Isandlwana camp, and basically said to his commander there, a man called Lieutenant Colonel Pauline, that you basically pack up the camp and follow me. There was no Zulu army to the east. The Zulus had moved round to the north, and that morning they attacked the camp at Isandlwana, and they overran it. 1,500 British soldiers, including the Natal native contingent, African soldiers, most were killed. The only white British soldiers that got out were the ones on horseback. And I'll come to some comments in a moment. And it was a major disaster. The Zulu invasion was put on hold. In fact, Chelmsford had to now retrace his steps, get out of Zululand. The other columns retreated as well eventually. And the follow-on, from that battle, was that part of the Zulu army that attacked Isandlwana was the reserve, and they didn't really see any action, and they felt they'd missed out. So the reserve corps under Keshweo, the Zulu king's half brother, crossed over the Buffalo River into the British colony of Natal, not to invade it. There's no way one regiment could invade the whole country, even the Zulus. But it was fundamentally to do a bit of looting, pillaging, find some farms, get some goodies, at least come back and say, look, we haven't returned from the battlefield empty-handed, because back at the battlefield, of course, the Zulus were helping themselves to all the booty of a defeated British army, and so they crossed the Buffalo River and started raiding, and they came to the mission station at Rorke's Drift. It was a missionary. It had originally been set up by an Irish trader called Jim Rorke, and he'd sold it to a Swedish missionary society, and their local resident minister was a man called Otto Witt, who appears in the film Zulu. And this is where we're going to go towards the film Zulu. Isandlwana, by the way, is covered in the film Zulu Dawn. But the film Zulu, iconic early 1960s film with Michael Caine and Stanley Baker in it. Anyway, the Zulus came across this mission station. The mission station had actually now been commandeered by the British Army, by Chelmsford in his invasion, and was now basically a supply depot and also a small hospital. And the garrison at Rorke's Drift basically were attacked. There was a garrison of about 140 men, slightly less, including wounded in the hospital. And they were attacked by 4,000 Zulus. Let's face it, the Zulus thought this is brilliant. Not only they've been pillaging a few farms, but now they can actually maybe kill some British soldiers. So like, we're real warriors as well. And we can probably get some guns. Little did they know that actually Rorke's Drift had a massive amount of ammunition there. And that actually was partly the saviour of the British troops. They had something like 20,000 rounds of ammunition stored, waiting to go to Chelmsford's army. But they broke them open and they actually used virtually all of the 20,000 in a fight that lasted from the late afternoon to almost the dawn. So through that night, the Zulus attacked again and again and again, and set the hospital alight, and the British held them off. But the British were down to their last few hundred rounds. If the Zulus had had one more attack, they probably would have broken through. Zulus eventually broke off the engagement, not least because these men hadn't eaten for well over 24 hours. The only water they'd had was when they crossed the Buffalo River, and they had run from the other side of Isandlwana. They were part of the attack, just weren't actually involved in the main attack. They came round the back to try and cut off any survivors, and they had continued running all the way to the Natal border. So quite frankly, and now they just fought a battle through the night. They were exhausted. And then some of them saw a column coming out of Zululand, and it wasn't a Zulu column. It was Lord Chelmsford. It was time to disengage. They went back to Zululand. They were derided when they arrived in Zululand for three reasons. Number one, because they'd failed. But number two, because number three, Keshweo, the Zulu king, had asked given two very specific orders. Do not attack the British if they have an entrenched position, and do not cross the Buffalo River into the British colony of Natal. Keshweo couldn't work out why the British had always actually been very friendly to him and now suddenly gone to war with him. But what he did know was he had to play the innocent in a worldwide PR game, and he could not afford his troops, his warriors, to cross the Buffalo River into Natal. He had to look like he was the victim. I've never even gone into British territory, and the British will come to me and are trying to take away my land. And the Zulus, his half-brother, had basically defied him on two counts, crossed the Buffalo River, and then decided to attack an entrenched British position at Rorke's Drift. And they came away empty-handed. Actually, his brother was banished, but appeared at the Battle of Lundi, the final battle of the Zulu Wars. And I'll tell the rest of that Zulu Wars bit at another stage. But many people, of course, look at the Battle of Isandlwana on the 22nd of January 1879 as a great British defeat. And how could Lord Chelmsford have been so stupid as to divide his force, his army, in the middle of enemy territory? And that takes away, and those are valid arguments, valid points, but it does take away one significant thing, that the victory was a Zulu victory. The Zulus had outmaneuvered Lord Chelmsford. despite not having all the modern materials of warfare that Chelmsford possessed in a 19th century British army. And it wasn't so much a British loss as, in my opinion, a Zulu victory. A Zulu victory that came at a hell of a price. They lost well over 1,000 of their best warriors at Isandlwana. And as King Keshwayo said, it felt like a spear had been thrust into the stomach of the Zulu nation. The losses were that severe. And of course, they were losses that he, as a king and as a military commander, couldn't replace. And ultimately, the British re-invaded, and he was defeated later in 1879 at the Battle of Ulundi. He was captured, he was exiled, actually ended up in London for a period. Interesting story, wowed London society, actually, as a very good-looking and very regal character, who was obviously far cleverer than many people at the time in a reasonably racist Victorian society believed black people could be. So eventually he went back to Zululand. He was reinstated because Zululand had fallen into basically civil war. But the civil war continued when he was there, and he died in the civil war. There you go. And we're at 30 minutes, and we're only on the 22nd of January. So let me just have a quick look what people are saying. Leslie DeVoe, Ammunition Smith. Yes, Ammunition Smith was a British Army chaplain at Rorke's Drift, and I've done a video about him. He doesn't appear in the film, but a fascinating character. I'm just whizzing backwards and forwards. Texas Q, I've missed a few things here. Thank you. There's lots going on here. 30th of January 1972, Uncle Heavy, thank you. Bloody Sunday massacre unfolded in London, or Londonderry, or Derry, as nationalists will call it in Ireland. Thank you, which, based on what we're talking about with Ireland and the question about what relations have been like, is interesting, isn't it? And history is all about narratives and always about perspectives. You know, I talked last year. I was at the. I'll come back to the point I'm going to make. But last year I was at the Battle of Empires, Clash of Empires exhibition in London, all about the Zulu Wars, and was chatting to a Zulu. His family had fought at Isandlwana, and he's now a tour guide, battlefield tour guide in South Africa. And he was basically saying, you know, actually it's interesting, in Zulu culture, they don't talk about Rorke's Drift, but they love talking about Isandlwana. Whereas when you think about it, what the Brits like to talk about is Rorke's Drift and all those Victoria Crosses that have been awarded, and how brave everyone was. And of course, there's a Welsh narrative, thanks to the film Zulu, which is, you know, and it was all Welshmen at Rorke's Drift, which wasn't actually true, but the 24th Regiment of Foot ultimately did become, within a couple of years, the South Wales Borderers Border Regiment. But nevertheless, so we all have narratives, and likewise, you know, Ireland is full of narratives, isn't it? Depends what side you're on, depends what stories you're told by your family, your community, depends how you then view events. Events happen in history. It's how we interpret them that gives us these different angles in history. And I find that fascinating. And obviously, I get a variety of comments on YouTube. You know, not all of them are positive about British military involvement around the world. Not always positive about British military involvement in the First and Second World Wars either, for that matter. Everyone has different perspectives, and there's no right or wrong. You know, I've said in here in the past, you know, one person's hero is someone else's villain. And don't we know, not least from British history and British post-colonial history, you know, one person's freedom fighter is someone else's terrorist. And then, of course, things change, and suddenly the terrorist now becomes a valued leader of an old Commonwealth country. You know, Bishop Makarios in Cyprus being an example, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya being another one. There we go. Invisible Ray, evening troops. I told you it was Zulu week. It was. I'm not going to go too much more into Zulu wars, because 22nd of January 1944, the Anzio landings in Italy during the Second World War. Anzio was just south of Rome, just southwest of Rome. If you look on a map of Italy, Italy had been invaded in 1943, and the problem with Italy is that, of course, it's a long, thin country, very mountainous, or certainly in the mountainous in the centre, which meant that it was actually very easy for the Germans to defend. And they basically had the Germans had created a defensive position along the casino line, centered around the monastery at Monte Cassino, and the Allied forces couldn't break through. And the Anzio landings were an attempt to basically bypass, land close to Rome, and turn the German flank. The Germans would need to probably back up past Rome to stabilize their line. And that was the great plan. Didn't quite work out like that. It was principally an American operation. There were British troops there. In fact, just to bring it up to you, I know I always mention it. I've mentioned him before. But there's my granddad, Ernie Harris. He was in the Ordnance Corps, truck driver. He was at Anzio. That's taken in Italy, actually. And you can see his Italian star there, and his other two, the 3945 star and the General Service Medal, Second World War Medal. But if you notice here, there's the oak leaf. He was mentioned in dispatches. In fact, he was mentioned in dispatches twice. I've only got one of the oak leaves. Yeah, you have to divvy them out around the family when he died. But so I've got one of the oak leaves, and he was mentioned in dispatches at Anzio. He was at Anzio. So nevertheless, the American commander, the overall Allied commander at Anzio. Let me just put that down here rather than put it back. General Lucas decided to, rather than break out of the beachhead, he would solidify the beachhead. He'd build it up, and that gave the Germans an opportunity to surround the beachhead, bring up a lot of their heavy guns, and they were basically stuck at Anzio from January the 22nd, 1944, right through to the 5th of June, 1944. And so, as Churchill famously said, I hoped that we were hurling a wildcat into the shore, and instead we got a stranded whale. But Anzio, great one, and I will do a video about Anzio in the future. I think it's a bit of a nod to my granddad, who, like a lot of men from that generation, didn't really talk about it. He never talked about his wartime service. The only thing he ever told me was once he brought back, and I don't know if it was dead or injured bodies, soldiers, in his lorry. As I said, he was a lorry driver, and he brought them back down to the beachhead from somewhere up near the front line or from a hospital or first aid post, and he had to wash out his lorry, and he said it was like a red waterfall of blood and water just coming off the back of his lorry. And I guess when you've seen that, you probably don't really want to talk and remember it too much, do you? But there you go. Let's just have a quick look here. General Lucas got kidnapped by the IRA. He escaped, but there were deaths on both sides as he made a break. Interesting, Tasha. General Lucas was selected, so General Clark could look incompetent, as all the other efforts to do so were to fail badly. Interestingly, yeah, there's a sort of jury out on how effective General Clark was. The only thing I can say about General Clark was that he arranged, well, he didn't just arrange for my granddad, but there's obviously, he gave out, a bit like big corporate companies sort of give like freebies and special mentions to employee of the month and that sort of thing. But my granddad and his brother-in-law were given a sort of an R&R break in Florence later in the war by General Clark, or on General Clark's orders, and they somehow got them to meet up, which was quite cool. Roger Waters, I'm not sure where we're going there. Sorry, folks. Jim Altgott couldn't do much with just 2 divisions. No, you couldn't. It was another one of these great ideas. The idea was to frighten the Germans. It was not. There's a myth that General Lucas missed his opportunity to capture Rome. I think historians, not least Keegan, have said, if he had tried to do that, he would have been caught out in the open, and the Germans would have decimated because he only had a limited number of forces. So the whole idea was by landing on, I think the general thought was he should have moved further inland than he did. But the idea was, fundamentally to panic the Germans into a mass withdrawal, up a sizable withdrawal up the Italian peninsula, not to capture Rome or to take on, to lead any great invasion of Italy. Happy Australia Day, 26th of January. Thank you very much, Darren. And I think, Darren, you're in Adelaide, South Australia, one or the other, something like that. Clark was not a fan of Churchill or the British overall. No, and quite a few American generals weren't. And of course, and it was vice versa. Montgomery was never a great fan of the Americans. And as I say, interesting, isn't it, that we we tend to look at events very much in, how many guns did someone have, or, and actually so often it's all driven by personalities and what decisions people make. And that's what's fascinating. I'm talking about doing Julius Caesar invading and his invasions of Britain, which is coming out hopefully later today, if ever I stop this live. And, the same sorts of reasons that Julius Caesar was invading Britain, lots of politics, lots of PR, are exactly the same reasons that generals and politicians make war decisions and other decisions to this day. And that's what I find fascinating. The technologies have changed, but human beings haven't changed very much at all. Leslie, nor were we fond of Monty. No. I can well imagine that actually in many respects, I can imagine Montgomery was hard work. Famous story I heard once was when Montgomery met Churchill and in the Second World War, and Churchill offered him a cigar and a drink, to which Montgomery, in a very clipped Montgomery way, basically said, I don't smoke, I don't drink, I'm 100% fit. To which Churchill naturally responded, well, I do drink, I do smoke, and I'm 200% fit. How true that quote is, I don't know, but you can imagine both of them saying the lines they did. So maybe it was true. Thank you, Invisible Ray. You're leaping in here. That's brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Right, let's move on. 23rd of January, 1909, the Tottenham outrage. Completely different to what we've just been talking about. The Tottenham outrage got nothing to do with Tottenham Hotspur losing to some non-league club or something in the cup. This was an anarchist heist in North London, in Tottenham. Anarchists stole a payroll going to a factory in Tottenham, just across the road from the police station, in fact. And strangely enough, the police all came out wondering what the hell was going on. The anarchists pulled their guns out. They were armed, because anarchists in those days, especially in that period, were fired on the police. And basically a pursuit across Tottenham, through the Hackney, through the marshes, and over into Walthamstow took place. It included, when the anarchists got to Walthamstow, they actually took over a tram and basically decided, at gunpoint, forced the tram driver to drive off in his tram. The police commandeered a tram that was going in the other direction, put it in reverse, and came after them. It's like a sort of Keystone Cops meets the anarchists sort of event. Fascinating, and I've done a story about that. It's one of my older videos. I love it as a story. So if you want a bit of fun about British history, London history, just before the First World War, then look out down in my channel for the Tottenham outrage. Great story. Back in South Africa, 24th of January, 1900, the Battle of Speenkop. I've done a video about this as well. This is in the Boer War, Second Boer War, Second South African War, whichever phrase you want to use, term you want to use for it, Anglo-Boer War. British attempted to seize a strategic mountain as part of in their attempts to relieve the siege of Ladysmith. Basically, they got it wrong. And in the ensuing battle, 234 British were killed, over 1,000 injured, for reasonably low, about 300 casualties on the Boer side. Interestingly, the British commander was Charles Warren, more famous as the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police during the Jack the Ripper or Whitechapel murders back in the 1880s. Also present at Speenkop were there were three serious world leaders. The Boer commander was Louis Botha, who became the first Prime Minister of the Union of South Africa in 1910. Mahatma Gandhi was there as a stretcher bearer long before he became the icon of Indian independence. But he was there on the British side as a stretcher bearer. And also on the British side was a young journalist by the name of Winston Churchill. Yes, he appears everywhere, doesn't he? And he was at Speenkop, which interestingly, 24th of January, same date, but in 1965, Winston Churchill died. After a long parliamentary career, and I will go into his story a little bit more when we come to his state funeral in, where are we? About a week and a half's time. Can't remember if it's next week. It falls into next week's history or the week after, but hey, bear with me on that one. Interestingly, he died on the same day, in other words, the 24th of January, that his father died. So 24th January, Winston Churchill died on the same day that his dad died, on the same day that he'd been at the Battle of Spienkop during the Boer War, all those years before, 65 years before. Darren would love a video on Cecil Rhodes and his involvement in the Boer War. Wow, you can tell I did some stories about. I've touched on the Boer War in the past. I've touched on the Indian Mutiny or the Indian Rebellion. So I do like to go to some controversial areas, and there's no one more controversial in Southern Africa than Cecil Rhodes. So fascinating character, not necessarily someone I like, but someone I am fascinated by, because he built up this business empire. In his 30s. By the time he was 40, he was the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony. He controlled the Kimberley diamond mines effectively. In his early 40s, he had one of the most significant holdings in the Johannesburg gold fields. By then, he'd established his own company, the British South Africa Company, which had proceeded to occupy modern-day Zimbabwe and Zambia. All by the time he was early 40s. He was actually in the Boer War. He was holed up in Kimberley, where his diamond empire was. The Kimberley was besieged. It was a major economic target for the Boers to take. It was the center of the world's diamond mining industry. If you're going to capture anything, why not capture that? And even better, Cecil Rhodes was there, and he was the arch imperialist. Don't forget, he had only a few years before had actually used his police force from the British South Africa Company to invade the Boer Republic of Transvaal and try and effectively have a coup d'etat. So the Boers had no love for Cecil Rhodes and would love to have captured him. By all accounts, he was a bit of a pain in the backside for the British commander in Kimberley. He's probably, I'm trying to think who a business leader, it would be like you being a military commander in a siege and Elon Musk being the leading civilian in your town. Okay, come what may, you'd spend half your time fighting the Boers and half your time trying to keep a lid on this very vociferous, very wealthy man who likes to get his own way and always has ideas about how he's going to get his own way. And Cecil Rhodes was very much in that ilk. Wouldn't like to say Elon Musk is like Cecil Rhodes or vice versa, but if you're looking for comparators, there are sort of, we'll leave it at that. Someone's bound to go for me and say that's absolutely rubbish. They're not the same, and they're not. But they had that power. In many respects, rather like Bill Gates has that power and that economic clout. That's the sort of clout that Cecil Rhodes had. By the way, Cecil Rhodes was not universally liked in Britain, even in this age of high imperialism. So an interesting person. Invisible Ray. Cecil Rhodes was a gay genius. Well, there you go. He certainly never married and certainly surrounded himself with young men. But then quite a lot of men in Victorian Britain did. And there's some sort of ambiguity. Were they gay? Were they just sort of ambivalent towards sex or heterosexual sex? Don't know. But Invisible Ray, if you've got any information, that was good. Texas Q, Zachary Miller, you'll have to do a bit on the underappreciated Admiral Thomas Cochrane. He's on my hit list. Admiral Cochrane, who was, ended up fighting for both the Chilean and indeed the Brazilian navies as they fought for independence against the Spanish and Portuguese, respectively, after the Napoleonic Wars. Interesting, very controversial at the time. Controversial figure, not in a Cecil Rhodes way, but he'd sort of left Britain under a bit of a cloud, and then redeemed his honour. And of course, many people believe Cochrane could have been the model for Jack Aubrey in the Master and Commander series. So there you go. This week in 1945, Auschwitz was liberated. That's a sobering thought, isn't it? History, and sometimes we need to remember history, and it's recent, and some of the recent things. British American, I remember my dad and granddad telling me when I was young regarding the Boer War, in that one, we, the British Empire forces, were the bad guys. True? Question mark. British American. So your question is basically, were the British the bad guys in the Anglo-Boer War, 1899 to 1902? I'm sure some of you have opinions. By all means, throw them in. Just a yes or no will be good enough at this stage, just so that I can keep up. Were the British good or bad? Were the goodies or the baddies? This is around perspectives again, isn't it? I always remember my son saying to me about the Zulu War. He watched Zulu when he was very young, when he was very little. He's in his 20s now. And I remember him saying to me, were the British goodies or baddies? And I said, it rather depends if you were a Zulu or not, doesn't it? So and the same probably for the Boer War. A lot more complicated as a general overview for me, a lot more complicated than many people believe. It wasn't all about the gold. And the Afrikaners or the Boers, because Afrikaners existed in the Cape Colony in particular, and a little bit in Natal Colony. The Boers weren't purer than the driven snow. And one of the very interesting things actually was that Edward Carsons, who ultimately was executed by the British for his support of the 1916 Easter Rising in Ireland, he actually did a paper just before the Boer War saying actually the British had a moral reason to fight the Boer War, which was on behalf of the black population in South Africa. Don't forget that apartheid didn't just come out of the blue. There was a long thread of how the Boers treated Africans. And don't forget the Boers, by the way, had taken over these Boer republics. They'd only established them in the 1830s, 1840s from land that they'd taken off indigenous African tribes. And indeed, some of those tribes weren't particularly indigenous, like the Nabila, who had fled from Zululand, from Shaka Zulu, and then went up into Zimbabwe. So, certainly you could argue that the British certainly didn't cover themselves in glory with the concentration camps, which, just health warning, they weren't concentration camps like Auschwitz that was being liberated in this week in 1945. Darren Marsh thinks we're a bit of both. Tasha says we were good. It was the Boers that attacked the British first. Yes, it was the Boers actually attacked. And so the British, could we say we were defending ourselves? Well, sort of. We were defending ourselves. Don't forget the Boers attacked. It was a preemptive strike by the Boers because the British were building up their forces in southern Africa. So it basically put political situation was getting out of hand, and it was sliding towards war. And the British were sending troops to South Africa, and the Boers basically decided to attack before those British reinforcements arrived. But yeah, interesting. Thank you very much, Tasha, for that. You're absolutely right. Gen 50-50. Invisible Ray, the Boers wanted slaves, we didn't. Certainly part of the Great Trek out of the Cape Colony in the 1830s. Part of the reason the Boers left the British Cape Colony was because they wanted to keep their slaves, and the British were obviously saying they couldn't. Again, a little bit more complicated than that, but part of the narrative, definitely. And British American Cochrane was the real Horatio Hornblower, perhaps. Yeah, maybe he was. Anyway, come on, we're rolling along here, and what have we got here? Just 25th of January, 1533, we had Henry VIII married Anne Boleyn, his second wife. A good one. Great stories behind that. Tudors. Someone said earlier, probably the bloodiest dynasty we had. A lot of, if you're a supporter of Richard III and the Plantagenets, you'd ask what the Tudors were doing on the throne in the first place. And Henry VIII and his wives, don't forget the whole Anne Boleyn thing, led to the English Reformation, of the Reformation of the English Church, and certainly the break from the English Church with the Roman Catholic Church, because the Pope didn't sanction Henry VIII to have a divorce from his first wife. So Henry basically broke from the Roman Catholic Church. Again, big sweeping statements here. We're covering a lot of history in 50 minutes so far. But he basically said, well, if I'm the head of the church rather than the Pope, then my church can grant me a divorce, can't it? Ta-da! So that's large part of where the English Reformation started and the break with Rome. And Anne Boleyn was his second choice. They had a daughter. Obviously, Anne Boleyn ultimately got beheaded by Henry. They fell out. He felt she was having an affair. He also felt that she had several miscarriages, hadn't borne him a son, and he believed that was actually a judgment from God. Another judgment from God. He had quite a few of these judgments from God, Henry. But they did produce a daughter, and she was Queen Elizabeth I, or eventually became Queen Elizabeth I. So there we go. Phantom of the Opera opened in Broadway this week in 1988. Uncle Heavy, you're on a roll here. Thank you. You need to become my research assistant, don't you? But that's great. Anne of 1,000 Days. Invisible Ray. She's so anti-man. I'm not quite sure what that's about. There you go. Jerry, hi. And hi to you too, Jerry. I hope you're enjoying this ramble through British history. 25th of January, 1644, the Battle of Nantwich. I'm only going to mention it because this took place during the English Civil War. Some of you know that I'm going to be doing a series about the English Civil War coming up. And if you're interested, it won't be here on YouTube, okay? It will be through my private channel. So if you're interested in the English Civil War, it will be a series, probably 5-6 talks on the English Civil War. Down below, you'll see this says sign up for my newsletter. Sign up for my newsletter. You'll get the details as and when it's work in progress. Battle of Nantwich during the English Civil War. Actually, every year, Sealed Knot have a massive celebration or reenactment at Nantwich in Cheshire to celebrate the Battle of Nantwich, which was a parliamentarian victory. It's called Holy Holiday, and it's this Saturday. So anyone who wants a bit of Civil War reenactment and is in the northwest of England or in the Cheshire area, head to Nantwich. In fact, if you head to Nantwich, I am going. So if you are going to Nantwich, I'll tell you what, on my website, thehistorychap.com, go to contact, hit the contact icon, drop me an email, tell me you're going to be there, give me your phone number, and if you are, I'll give you a bell when I'm there. We could meet up, maybe have a coffee, maybe marvel at these people who do the Sealed Knot, all these reenactments. I'm going there to get a fair few photos. I'll let you into a secret. It's Sarah's birthday on Saturday, and I went and booked this, and it's not gone down well. So I'm going to be in Nantwich for a very limited time, taking photos, and hopefully my backside won't be too black and blue by when I return to see Sarah. So anyway, parliamentary victory in the English Civil War, Battle of Nantwich. Sarah Jane, Sealed Knot, do the Battle of Naseby near me as well. Naseby, great battlefield. I've been there in the past with another History Chap supporter, Rob. Rob's one of my long-time supporters and a member of my supporters club. And he and I met for a beer, went for lunch, and then we walked the battlefield of Naseby. And it's a great battlefield to go and visit. Actually, it's pretty much like it was in the battle in the battle, which is really good. And Darren, happy birthday, Sarah. I will pass on your regards. It might get me another brownie point, Darren. Thank you very much. Right. Where are we at? 26th of January, 1871. The Rugby Football Union is formed. This is Rugby Union. And it was formed in London on this day, 26th of January, 1871. There are about 30 clubs present at this founding. I'm not sure, none of them are the premiership clubs nowadays, although interestingly, one was going to attend the founding meeting. Representative Wasps, Rugby Club Wasps, were invited, and they sent a delegate. Now it all got a bit confused. Chinese whispers, always good. We're not quite sure whether the Wasps representative failed to attend. He claimed that he'd been given the wrong date, and he turned up for a meeting where he was sitting there all by himself, wondering where the hell all these other rugby aficionados were. The other story is that he went to the wrong. He got the right date and the right time, but went to the wrong hotel. And he's a rugby man after all. So what did he do? Sitting around waiting for the meeting to start. No one else seemed to be there. He had a few beers. And being a rugby man, a few more beers and a few more beers. And anyway, Wasps did not attend the founding meeting of the Rugby Football Union, but they're very much part of it nowadays, aren't they? So that's where rugby. It's the first time that rugby was codified and formalised into a club, like into an organisation. The Rugby Football Union in 1871. Same day, but a few years later, 26th of January 1885, Charles Gordon is killed at Khartoum in Sudan. Forces of the Mahdi stormed Khartoum. And if you want to know the story about Charles Gordon in Khartoum, and indeed the whole attempts by the British to rescue him in Khartoum, I'll go to my channel. There's more stories about the Sudanese wars than you can shake a stick at, isn't there? Really interesting, actually. The story of the history chap, loads of you will know that I started with this story about Eam, the plague village, which I recorded during lockdown as a way of entertaining my friends. And some of them said they couldn't do the live talk, which was on Facebook Live. So could I stick it on YouTube? That's how my YouTube channel started. Nothing really happened. Crickets. Then I did a talk about the Zulu Wars to coincide with the anniversaries that we've been discussing today. And I did that back in 2021. So about a year after I'd started YouTube. And that video took off. It took several months to take off, actually. It finally took off in about the June of that year, May of that year. And then the following year, beginning of the following year, again, to coincide with Gordon, this date, in 2022, I did a two-parter about Gordon, which, yeah, it got some traction, but not a lot. And then I thought, well, you've got to complete the story of what the hell happened afterwards. So I did one about the Battle of Omdurman in 1898, where Kitchener reinvaded Sudan and defeated the Mahdist forces. And that one suddenly went off like a steam train. It was released, I can't remember when I released it, early in the week, maybe the weekend. And anyway, again, it took about a week to take off. And I was driving with Sarah in the Cotswolds, and I don't know, I looked at my phone, and you always look at what's going on YouTube. And I said, something blinking weird's going on here. I've had like more views in the last hour than I had in the whole of last month. And really, you know, the whole, where most of you probably come to me, not necessarily through that video, but the whole exposure that I got on YouTube and continue to get on YouTube was thanks to that Battle of Omdurman in particular. So, but there you go. So General Charles Gordon died this day in 26th of January, which is today, 1885 in Khartoum. I am sure. And before we go on, let's just have a look at, we've got a couple of things here. Uncle Heavy, happy birthday to Sarah. Please don't beat up Chris. Well, not too much. If you see me with a black eye, you know it just didn't go too well. But I'm taking her out for dinner on Saturday night, so I think Darren, Rugby Union World Cup was held in an Italian POW camp during World War II. 6 matches, I think, and the South Africans won. Wow, Darren, I didn't know that. Now, that could be a good story to tell. That is a great story to tell. In fact, at the end of this, I'm going to put it in my little book of wonders, but move it up, might highlight it or something. But thank you for that, Darren. I'll look into that. Kieran, Wasp professional team went bust. Chris, the amateur team live on. Don't I know it? Worcester Warriors gone bust as well. Uncle Heavy, my apologies. The Challenger disaster was indeed on the 28th of January. Okay. Please be sure to hit that like. Yes, thank you very much, Jim. Happy birthday, Sarah. Blimey, she's going to love this, isn't she? Bernie Steakhouse. No, Invisible Ray, it's not. It's actually Dishoom, an Indian restaurant in Birmingham. Hit that like button. I hope you're talking about me, Jim, or maybe you're referring to something else further up. I don't mind you highlighting any of your own channels, by the way, folks. Prawn cocktail starter. No. Right, so come on, let's finish off this week in British history for you. 27th of January 1859. Sorry, 1859. 27th of January 1859. Tomorrow. The first of Queen Victoria's 40 grandchildren was born. That's pretty impressive to have 40 grandchildren, isn't it? Although maybe not. Can you imagine? You'd just be on constant babysitting duty, and Christmas would cost a fortune. I mean, realistically, that means every month you've got at least 3 birthday presents for grandchildren to buy as well. admittedly, she was the queen, so I guess she's got the resources. But first grandchildren born. Actually, here's the great irony: first one who she always had a very close relationship with. It was Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Kaiser Bill of First World War fame was her very first grandchild through her daughter, called Princess Victoria, Princess Royal. She married the German Emperor Wilhelm I. And he wasn't the Wilhelm, he was the Crown Prince of Prussia when she married him. But anyway, he had a very short-lived tenure. He died very young as Emperor of Germany and was succeeded by a slightly damaged Wilhelm II, who had a lot of, whilst he loved his grandmother, had a real antipathy with the English. So a real love-hate relationship with the English, or with the British, shall I say. But interestingly, in this week, in 1900, it was actually on the 22nd, Queen Victoria died. So 1901, sorry. So this week we've had Queen Victoria's first grandchild born, but also just a few days before 22nd, but in 1901, Queen Victoria died. And who was at her bedside when she died? Kaiser Bill. How about that? So this was a week in which we also had the Battle of Basing, Wessex versus the Vikings in 871. We had Ramsay MacDonald formed the very first Labour government, very first Labour Prime Minister, 1924. And also John Logie Baird publicly exhibited television, moving pictures on television for the first time in 1926. Another British invention for a little island. We haven't, we have punched quite a way above our weight, haven't we? So so there you go. It was also a week in which I attended an online talk from the Battlefields Trust about the Battle of Mount Badon, or Mount Baden as one or two people call it, but Mount Badon, as the lecturer called it, Professor Ken Dark. He's a lecturer in archaeology from University College London. Really fascinating talk, lasted about an hour, all about the Dark Ages, when the Romans were leaving Britain, and how Romano Britain tried to keep going, and the influence of the Germanic, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes had, and the showdown, which may or may not have involved King Arthur, if indeed there was a King Arthur, at Mount Badon, and where on earth it was. And his view was it's probably in the area of Bradbury Rings or Bath. That's his view. It made sense geographically, strategically, but there are other options. But anyway, those of you who are interested in British history, especially if you live in Britain maybe and like visiting sites, I would recommend the Battlefield Trust. I'm not on a retainer for them, by the way. I just think they're great. I think they cost 28 quid a year. That's pretty good. Loads of resources about battles, and they have online talks. They also have various battlefield tours and things as well. So if you're into British battles and things like that, give them a look out. We Britons. Thank you, Invisible Ray. Were the Dark Ages called that because there were so many knights? No. I'm not sure, QL Library, if that's a fun question, because let's face it, we've had Monty Python quoted earlier on today, but fundamentally Dark Ages was named because actually no one really, historically, didn't know what was going on in them. It was a bit of a black hole in history, because a lot of the written records, Angles and Saxons initially didn't have any written records. Then when they started getting written records, of course, and tried to recall the oral histories they'd had, the Vikings rocked up and were burning manuscripts and things left, right, and centre. So a lot of those records were lost as well. So it tends to be called the Dark Ages because people didn't know what, looking back in history, didn't know what was going on. At the time, they didn't call them the Dark Ages. It was a very old joke. Okay, fair enough. But anyway, now you know where the Dark Age bit comes from. Anyway, sensible bit. Sarah Jane, that joke went over his head. Bless him. Oh, is that me? Jokes don't normally go over my head, but thank you very much. So there you go, folks. Out of all that stuff you've heard today, is there anything you'd love me to do a talk on in future? Or indeed, is there any subjects from British history generally that you would love me to talk on? We've had Sir Thomas Cochrane has been mentioned. Obviously, Darren, you've mentioned this fascinating Rugby World Cup in a German prisoner of war camp during the Second World War. That sounds great. Uncle Heavy, I think you've just repeated what I've said, which is cool. So any thoughts, anything that you would like me to talk about, by all means, put it in there. Otherwise, the Battle of Towton. I've got a video on that, Tasha. Have a look on my channel. There's a Battle of Towton. Did it about 18 months ago, something like that. So dig that one out. Thank you, Invisible Ray, for your thing. Tasha, Ferry Bridge to Towton. Okay, thank you very much. That one will come. I would like to do a few more about British battlefields and possibly visit them. And maybe we should do what I did with Rob. Just say I'm going to be there. Anyone who fancies meeting up, I'm going to be at the battlefield at this time. Turn up if you want to. Maybe you can go for a beer or a coffee or something afterwards. Caesar invading Britain. Watch this space. I'm getting off this video in a moment, this live in a moment, to finish Caesar's invasion of Britain, 55 and 54 BC. The Battle of Medway actually took place in the main Roman invasion in the 40s AD, and that will come at a later stage. I've got to set the scene with Caesar coming to Britain but not conquering, and then we can talk about the next Roman invasion as well. So that's coming. Do the Madagascar attack. Thank you. That's on my list. Not high up, but this is your opportunity to vote for things and move them up the pecking order. Michael, the period in Greek history. Michael, I'm trying to concentrate on British history, not because I think it's superior or anything else like that. And in fact, my first groundings in history were ancient history. That's what I was taught in my school. I was at a very traditional school in South Africa, and they basically started with the Phoenicians and worked forward. So I've got a soft spot and a bit of a knowledge for ancient history, but I am trying to keep it British-centric, just so it doesn't get totally out of control. It's hard enough telling stories from British history and linking them all together without then moving off into other areas. Fascinating. There are some great stories out there. I'm fascinated by the French invasion of Mexico to establish the Empire of Mexico in the middle of the 19th century. Little known by most Brits. Massive war for the French. The battles that made Britain. Okay, that's a good one. Thank you. Thomas Paine was born this week. Oh, sorry, that's another one from Uncle Heavy. He's on a roll here. Sarah Jane, the Roman legion that went missing in Scotland. Yeah, the Eagle of the Ninth. I think Eagle of the Ninth. Yeah, we'll talk about that, and indeed whether they ever did really go missing in Scotland. Fascinating. And of course, that was made into a film reasonably recently called The Eagle, with a lot of poetic cinema license, aren't they all? But I love the opening bit of The Eagle when they're traveling on the boat in the waterways of England. I thought it was fascinating with the Romano British and the old cows, and then of course the attack by the Britons and the Druids in his chariot. That was all quite good. The rest of the film after that, sort of, I kept sort of watching my clock. Claudius's invasion of Britain. Okay, that's coming. British history is quite rich enough, I would think. Certainly some great stories, coming from Caesar invading Britain right through to things like the Tottenham outrage that I mentioned earlier, and we've got these things like the World Cup, Rugby World Cup in the prison camp. Darren, I don't know how much truth there is in it, but I love it. I love the story. Tom Paine, Lewis. Not quite sure where we took. You took an ad for the team, Uncle Heavy. Thank you very much, mate. Yeah, Francesco, The Eagle is a sort of Hollywood Far West movie, good for entertainment. Yeah, and certainly the people from the north of Scotland who look something more like punk rockers than ancient Brits, although they definitely did paint their bodies and things, but the hairstyle looked more like something out of Last of the Mohicans. But there you go. Yeah, I'm glad you like that, Francesca. Look, folk, end of a week of British history. I hope you've enjoyed it. Athelstan and the unification of England. Well, there's obviously a bit of a feeling here that I could do a little bit more going back into British history. And don't get me wrong, folks, there are stories from British military history, and not least, from the 19th century and the 20th century that I still want to tell. but there are other stories from British history. As someone said there, it's a rich story in its own right, and I'd love to tell some more of those. Hopefully I'll have your support doing that. If you only want me to be 19th century colonial wars, do shout out. But hopefully you'll enjoy me just broadening the story base a bit more and really getting an understanding of where we come from. Because I think, I'm an absolute believer, it's only when you understand where you come from that you can understand why we are in the place we are now, good and bad, and why other people have the perspectives they have, not just of history, but indeed of Britain, good and bad. So that's what I'm hoping to do. I've said before, I think this is quite frankly, I think this is a lifelong project. And wow, excited for it, actually. Excited to be doing it. Excited to be thinking about how I can tell the story of Britain to more and more people, not just on YouTube, but on other channels and through my podcasts and indeed through my live speaking. And don't forget, if any of you are members of history societies, local national trust associations, even things like U3As, WIs, even military societies, wargaming societies, if you think that you would enjoy, or your members would enjoy, a talk from me, then get in touch. Don't do it here. Get in touch through my website. Hit the contact. So go to www.thehistorychap.com. Hit the contact button. And then at least we can have a bit of a paper trail of a discussion. But if you think actually, Chris would love to do a talk. I'm talking soon to the Friends of the Mercian Regiment, doing Dad's Army and their real-time wartime service. I've got a few others coming up. I've done one recently about the history of British pantomime. That's great. Oh yes, it is. We've done one about the history of British coronations as well, which is and that sort of centres a lot on Athelstan and his and the Anglo-Saxon kings, but then it really rocks up with George IV and his completely anarchic coronation in 1821. Another great story that's got nothing to do with fighting, but just I think it's great. My wife loves your videos. She says she hears your passion. Yeah. I'm just fascinated. All of us at school had one subject that we really loved, sport or maths or singing in a choir, whatever it was, acting. Mine was history. Fell in love with it from the word go, and God only knows how I fell in love with the Phoenicians. But seriously, from the word go, it's always been the subject I've loved. This is only a small part of my book collection, but love telling the stories, and hopefully I'll tell it with a bit of passion and make you think, but also make you sit back and just be entertained as well. History does not have to be boring lectures. And I've been to too many National Trust meetings where I've sat through some speakers who are like, oh my Lord, you know your stuff, but you're sending me to sleep. I don't think I'll send people to sleep. Maybe people don't like my enthusiasm or the fact I sound very middle class in English, which is quite fun because I went to a comp. My dad comes from Walthamstow, so not that middle class, eh? But nevertheless, I enjoy telling the stories, and I hope I can tell them for many years to come. And I hope I can, I hope you will support me for many years to come as well, and enjoy the journey that I'm going on at the minute. So with that, I'm going to thank you all for joining me today. I'm going to crack on now with the Julius Caesar's invasion of Britain. Watch this space. I'm going to have to really get my bum into gear because I've got to record it. I've then got to edit it. I've then got to put all the blinking visuals on, and then I've got to upload it into YouTube. So I think back end of this afternoon, guys, maybe 5, probably not 5 now, more like 6 o'clock, something like that. Hopefully I'm going to have it up and running. Come what may, it will be going out tonight at some stage. So keep with me, and I will see you very soon, if not before. Same time, same place, next Friday. Take care.